how to strengthen your knees. So knee pain isn't fun. I had a small sprain in my left knee, my left, when I was younger, and even just that little injury, that wasn't a good time. If you've ever had any knee issues at all, whether they're big or small, you know how frustrating they can be. Aside from the pain, they can have quite a big psychological impact. You're not sure what you can and can't do. It can really impact your everyday life and your movement practice too. So my knees are a bit patchy from the old vitiligo, but there are a few things that I do to make sure they're healthy, at least on the inside. So today we're gonna go with 10 quick fire tips. I think there's 10, yeah, 10. To improve your knee health, reduce pain and injuries, and get you moving like a hero. Let's get to it. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is releasing. So getting one of these and freeing up tightness in any of the tissues surrounding the knee. So if you're holding tension in the quad, in the back of the knee, in the calf, any area that's sort of in the vicinity of your knee, then that's probably going to impact how that knee is aligned, how it functions, and potentially then cause pain, discomfort, and injuries. So a good place to start if you've got some knee issues, aside from going to see someone, seeing a professional, is to free up some of that tension. So using a roller, try not to take your head off with it, or a lacrosse ball, tennis ball, kind of relax the nervous system, free up some of the tension in those tissues, and get things moving nice and smoothly again. On a similar note, we want to be looking at our mobility in our hips and our ankles too. So we want to have a degree of stability in the knee. It's a hinge joint, just like the elbow. So ideally just flex and it extends. For it to be stable, having mobility in the ankles and the hips is super important. So you can do things like Ido's squat routine for opening up the hips. I've got my hip routine as well that I'll link in the description and put in a card, which might go by there. So we're looking at improving flexion, extension of the hip, but also internal and external rotation too. Similarly in the ankle, we're looking at improving our dorsiflexion, having full extension, and also kind of lateral flexion as well in the ankle. If there's room there to play with, then the knee is going to take less strain if we go out of alignment, or when we go out of alignment, because it's inevitable. So you can incorporate this mobility work in your day-to-day, your morning routine, but also as part of your prep work, your warm-up before anything that's going to potentially be putting pressure on your knees. Tip number 3, spend as much time as you can in this deep low squat position. So there's lots of potential causes for knee pain, but one of the big ones, I believe, and lots of other people who are much smarter than me believe, is that we very rarely get into this full closed down position. So we're at full flexion of the hip, full flexion of the knee, and full flexion at the ankle as well. So oftentimes we're just sat there at our desks and we're kind of in this half squat position. We don't go fully down and really close that joint. When we do that, we kind of lubricate the joint with synovial fluid, but we're also making sure we're maintaining that natural range of motion that we're kind of ideally supposed to have. If you can squat more like this, work down towards that deep squat. You can start with the heels lifted on a block and then kind of work your way down to flat-footed. The more time that you can spend in that squat throughout the day, probably going to see some benefits when it comes to the healthier knees, but also with the hip mobility and with your ankle mobility too. So it's just good. It's good, really. Moving from the mobility work to kind of strengthening stuff, we can also look at doing a lot more single leg balance, stability and strengthening work. So simple things like a single leg balance is amazing for knee stability and just general knee health. Then you can step things up by doing little reaches and kind of balance drills, yoga poses. You can do the pistol squat, the shrimp squat, and single leg deadlifts. There's so many amazing single leg drills. I'll do a separate video on that, I think, at some point. Yeah, incorporating some single leg stuff into your training and into your everyday life, like when you're brushing your teeth. That's amazing for your knee health too. So tip number 5, we're thinking about our technique during everyday movement patterns and whilst we're in the gym. So if we take the squat as an example, we're squatting, back squat. A common fault we see is that knee valgus. So if we come down, the knees start to cave in, or as on that upwards position, the upwards phase, the knees start to cave in, we get that knee valgus. So what we're going to think about is screwing the feet into the floor. The cue that Kelly Starrett uses, the guys at Mobility Ward, is knees not in. So we're thinking about driving our knees outwards or keeping them tracking in line as opposed to caving in. So we're using that external rotation force, and we're less likely to tear any ACL or blow your knee out. Same deadlifting, it's that similar external rotation instead of having the knees caving in and crumpling. And we also want to think about this outside the gym, because there's no point in practicing that whilst we're training and then doing something completely different in everyday life. So when we're walking, when we're sprinting, when we're going upstairs in particular, thinking about keeping that knee tracking over the toes or slightly out as opposed to caving in. It's not good. Oh, quick side note, that's also easier if you're having your foot tracking forward as opposed to out to the side. So as well as knee position, I want to think about where your foot is landing and positioned as well. Getting very warm in here. Point 6, we're thinking about activating your VMO, your vastus medialis, which is one of the quad muscles just on the inside of the knee there. So why is it important? It's a muscle that we often see is quite weakened. It's involved in helping the patella, the kneecap, track properly in the knee joint. So if it's weak, then the patella isn't going to track as well as it could, and that could cause some issues, cause some damage in the knee and maybe some pain. You can do VMO activation exercises, firstly by just poking it and trying to activate it, and there's a load of different other ones you can do that I'll link to in the description box below. Basically any knee extension exercises, they're pretty good. But I don't really think they work in the context of the whole. So if you're doing the release stuff, the deep tissue stuff, you're watching your form, you're doing all the other tips that I'm mentioning, then a little bit of that isolation strengthening can also help too, potentially. But if you're just doing it on its own, then it might not actually be that helpful. Cool. The next thing is to think about being barefoot as often as you can, whenever it is convenient or possible for you to do that. So we get sold this idea that we have to wear big, thick cushion trainers all the time if we're out running or we're training, but there's actually studies that have shown that the more expensive cushion trainers that you have, the higher your risk for knee injuries and running related injuries. So if you're around the house or at the beach, just being barefoot when you can is ideal. If you're training, I like the Merrells or Vibrams. I've included them. Check out the link below to my kit list, they're in there. But yeah, they're both really good shoes. So when you're barefoot, your feet and your knees and your hips are doing the work that they're supposed to. They're doing the cushioning, they're doing the shock absorbing, as opposed to trying to recreate that with a shoe. I know from my own experience, at least, my knees, my ankles, my hips feel a lot healthier since I've been doing a lot more barefooting. Tip number 7, 8. Just want to quickly touch on building strength as well. I think that's an important factor that often gets missed out on, really. Building strong hips as well as sort of mobile hips is going to protect your knees. Having your glutes switched on so you can externally rotate and internally rotate to a degree as well. From my experience, when my glutes feel active and engaged, then everything else feels a lot more stable. And similarly with the core as well, if you've got the ability to activate your deep core musculature, not just kind of the mirror muscles, you have a more stable center to work from. When you're doing dynamic things, whether it's in sport or just in everyday life, I feel like your knees take less of the brunt of the force. I don't know, there's not necessarily hard science behind that. I think there are a few studies, but yeah, just from my personal experience, it feels a lot nicer and safer. Tip number 9, I just want to touch on recovery and progressive overload. So 2 important factors that for some reason I've grouped into one point. But yeah, if you're doing anything that's knee intensive, whether you're lifting at the gym, squatting, deadlifting, or if you run or you do jiu-jitsu or anything really that's involving the knee joint, which is pretty much anything, it's important to modulate your intensity so you're not completely blasting yourself and going as hard as you can every time you're in the gym. And also when you do go hard, ensuring that you're recovering properly, like you're leaving enough time for your body to recover, and you're also doing the right things, like sleeping well, eating well, to promote recovery. And then on a similar note, for the last point, is nutrition. So whilst a lot of knee pain is potentially structural and is related to alignment and misalignment and that sort of stuff, potentially just be an inflammatory issue, whether that's from overtraining or from the foods that we eat. If we can base our diet off predominantly whole foods that are nutrient dense, help keep inflammation at bay and kind of dampen joint pain and stop it from becoming like a chronic thing. There's also supplements like turmeric, cumin, and some people use fish oil and what's it called? Glucosamine. Supplements aren't always necessary. I think it's more important to make sure you've got a healthy base first, and then you can play around with them if you want, and they might help you out. Hope that was useful. I hope you got some sort of value from it. Let me know if you do try out these tips and how they go for you, or if you've got any questions, then let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want more, and if you want to support the work that I put out. I've linked below to my hero toolkit, kit list, some of the things that I found valuable, movement gear, books, a few things I use to create content as well. If you buy any of them, then Amazon or whoever I'm working with kicks me a little bit of spare change and helps keep me going. There's a link down below to that, and thank you so much if you do decide to check it out. Other than that, have a healthy, amazing, heroic week, and I will catch you next time.